Okay, so this is a talk on astrology versus tarot, and I have the awesome Richard Swatton here with me today, who I have been very fortunate to study under, who has a very vast knowledge of astrology, symbolism, and also Jungian archetypes, which is absolutely fantastic. As many of you know, the reason I wanted to branch out on the channel was to bring more to people other than just weekly and monthly tarot scopes. You know, there's so much of a broader understanding to be gained about ourselves and the world around us if we delve into topics and subjects, in a broader fashion. So, Richard, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on my channel. I'm super excited and very, very humbled. Please tell us about yourself. What do you, give us the rundown.
Yes. Okay. Well, my chief profession is as a psychotherapist. I would call myself, if I had to pigeonhole myself, it would be an integrative psychoanalyst. I'm not trained as a psychoanalyst, but I use analytic understanding, the dynamics of the psyche, which then utilizes the relationship between client and therapist as the vehicle through which transformation and insight takes place. So I've been doing that for the past 30 years, and I've been through my own analysis. I was in psychotherapy quite a long time, did about a 12-year Jungian analysis and various other things, body work, and all the trainings that you have to go to, which took me about 7 or 8 years. Anyway, that's what I do. But formally to that, I was a jazz pianist and studied at Trinity College and always loved that. I became a professional pianist when I left college, 1982, actually 84, because then I came to London after my first degree. Anyway, I resolved in 94 to become a psychotherapist, so I changed my professions and things throughout that throughout the 90s. When it comes to astrology, I've always been interested in things in the unknown. I think my first introduction to magic and things like that, and the things beyond, the veil of mysteries, the strangeness of life, all of that, I was always a curious boy. And I saw a magician when I was 5 years old, and I wanted to become one. That was it. I didn't know how it happened. I was somehow, it's a funny moment. It's like a fated moment. Lots of people see magicians, lots of people think, but something turns a light on. Now, you talked about this when we had a trial for our talk about that woman that you saw.
Yes.
You were introduced, and it's something inside lights up and it goes, oh, I need to know about that. It might be worth telling that story. And there have been several times in my life that's happened. So after that, I became an advocate of conjuring and magic and things like that. And then around about the age of 16, I came across an astrologer who was also an occultist, and he taught me astrology. And I've told the story before, but it was when I was I was selected by the Portsmouth and District Magic Circle that I belonged to at that time to be a performer at a Bristol Magic Convention, to be the representative of that. And so I did my little act on stage, and somebody saw me doing it and obviously saw something in me, and we had a conversation, and that someone was this theosophist, occultist, and his wife was a homeopath, and a couple of children in Wales and so on. Anyway, we struck up a fascinating conversation. He used to send me astrology books, at least one every 2 weeks, and I didn't know who this strange man was, but he was teaching me to read quickly and to assimilate and so on. And after about a year, 20, 25 books or so, I met him in South Wales, went across there. Conversations lasted forever, 10-hour conversation, 8-hour conversation. He had a massive library. He was known in the area as a kind of the strange man on the corner, and the number of his door was 13, obviously.
Oh, wow.
And he knew various occultists in London, magicians and so on, and also something of a psychic himself. But he was a theosophist and was a member of the Western mystery tradition in certain occult lodges, which was about a system of mental magical training, what they used to call the Western mysteries, which is why it's called the Western mystery tradition, or the esoteric tradition. So I was introduced to that and various practices from that, the divination of symbols, the meditation of the tree of life, more entering into symbols, visualizing them. I never really succeeded greatly in astral projection, although I had my moments. I've walked through a wall before. That was interesting. I hypnotized my first rabbit at the age of 11. And, I was always interested, had my fingers in lots of pies. And I think it was this idea that there was something behind the appearances of life. And that, of course, is the key word to what occultism means. It's what's hidden. But occultism is a kind of semi-spiritual, semi-energy form, mystical. It's a kind of halfway house, I think, between spirituality and metaphysical psychic reality. And it has words such as astral plane and the mental plane and the etheric planes, and it has its own language for describing the mysteries of the inner world, and also connects to various practices, as I say, astral projection. And I got very interested in scrying and all that. Anyway, when I came to astrology, then I studied it very seriously, and moved from occultism eventually into psychotherapy, because I found my own problems were not being treated by these various mental exercises and program of the mystery tradition, although I'm steeped in it. Came across the works of Noel Till in the States, and entered Liz Green's school, the Centre for Psychological Astrology, in 1985.
Wow.
I finished in 1988, got my diploma and everything else, and then started teaching astrology. And from 1988, I took a break in the mid-2000s and then came back to it to start to teach again and start writing around about 2009, 2010 in the London School of Astrology, which is where
you met me.
That's right. And the wonderful Frank Clifford, who runs that school, and publisher, bon viveur. He's around everywhere. He's lectures. He's a palmist. He's a writer. He's a speaker. He's a lecturer. He's all round good egg in this field that we are so attracted to. Absolutely. Anyway, I hope that summarizes something there.
Yeah, for sure. So, as I mentioned, I've been lucky enough to study under Richard and Frank as well, actually, who set me on a completely different path with understanding astrology, which was wonderful. So, before we go into delving into more about astrology and tarot and the symbolism therein, just a couple of things that I want to kind of help demystify. So many people, when they watch my videos, whether it's me dipping my toes into the astrology or my tarot scopes, one of the ideas that I always try to get across to people is this idea of fate, and what that actually means, and how we can work alongside it. We hear these terms nowadays of co-creating your destiny and free will and fate and all of those things, and I kind of feel like we don't have them clarified enough. So one thing that I heard a long time ago that's really stuck with me is it's fate and free will, not fate versus free will. And I guess one of the ways that I try to explain that to people is how you get to specific events in your life is your choice. Where you go from specific events in your life, again, is completely your choice. However, I also believe that as souls we incarnate to have certain types of experience. So, therein lie the process of how we get there and where we go from. It's all down to us. And, that for me is the whole idea of co-creating your destiny. So One of the questions that we often get in these fields is, does fate negate free will? So I want you to open that up for us.
The answer, complicatedly, is yes and no. And it requires going into about what we mean by fate, destiny, and free will.
Yeah.
I think the best way of saying it is you say it's an accumulation of choices. In many ways, our destiny, our destination, which is essentially what it means, that it's on a course somewhere. And through one means or another, somehow we feel pulled upon it. How we adapt to our fate, in other words, what we've been given through our genetic, there are all kinds of fate. I mean, some people have physical fates. They have things wrong with their heart or their brain or something unwinds a particular thing. This is a very physical kind of fate, and that's not the kind that you and I are dealing with.
Yeah.
Although sometimes we come across it. I've got a little story about that I'd like to tell you a little later on. But what we mean by fate is a kind of imprinted, predestinatory character, as Jung called it. We're born into a particular family, and so we take on their fate through an osmosis of their personality, and we take on their past too. This is where Jungian stuff is so good that, when we come to pinpoint our problems in life, Freud looks around in childhood and around the childhood phases and what went wrong with them and so on. And that's all fine. But why did we have those problems relating to our world? Often because our parents did. Mm-hmm. They had limited views. They were unconscious of this, that, or the other, or they tried their best. And unfortunately, they pass on inherited family patterns. And where does the family come from? Well, it's part of a culture. So you take on the fate of your culture or your race. See? And then that's part of the north or south of the equator. It's part of the hemispheric, And so in many ways, our fate is oriented around our environment where we're born, how much money we have or not, how much education we get. So there is a lot of limitations placed on us. But the type of fate that we're talking about or that we're involved with is slightly different. I like the Jungian way of seeing it, that it's that we've got to go along with what we've got in a more conscious or less conscious way. And this is where this whole process of choice comes in, because there's I think it's a Greek concept called harmomene or harmomene, and it's a thread going throughout all our life, and in a way our life is a sum total of our choices.
Yeah.
For what happens to us, not necessarily what things mean to us. That's something slightly different. But how do we make choice? How do we choose? We choose on limitations of our knowledge and understanding, and a limitation of our consciousness to see things. So we can expand our awareness more broadly through an inner and outer education. Then we can make more informed choices. That's what astrology is about. It's what tarot is about. It's about you see the pattern unfolding in a horoscope. You see the pattern, and then you ask your client, what are you going to do with it? And if a client says, oh, I didn't know I had that pattern, then you've helped that client get in touch with something inside themselves, which then they can move with. You're an Aquarius. You can't get outside that framework of Aquarianness. No. It will appear in your personality. It will appear in what you do and the way that you think. It's a pattern that you embody. But what you do with it, how conscious you are of it, and of your reactions to the world through this predestinated character, if you can become more conscious of that, then your choices are more conscious.
Yeah, absolutely.
But finally, what if you get a connection or a line of communication with the unconscious potentials in you that are forming throughout your life? You could call them karma, you could call them inherited patterns, it doesn't matter what, but you have a kind of fated dimension, a group of potentials or some purpose in your life, and it depends on how conscious you are of it. And tarot and images and dreams and all of these different dimensions can get you more in touch with this inner dimension of fate. But fate is not fixed as such. It can be moved along with. But the realm of choice depends on how conscious you are. And the more conscious you are, therefore you make different choices. And so fate unfolds, at least in its material form, in different ways. So we have a certain choice about how certain fates materialize in life and how they don't. So that's a kind of, perhaps that's a long-winded answer to answer a simple question.
No, it's great. It's brilliant. And actually, a much expanded and way more eloquent way of putting what I said, and I totally agree with you. I think we are definitely born into a physical realm of fate, of course, as well. And it's really interesting that you mentioned about the family dynamic that we're born into.
Yeah.
It's very important for sure. And one of the things that I've often believed is your challenges, or the challenges that your family, your parents, and all the rest of it give you, are a big part of shaping what you need in order to fulfill certain parts of your destiny. This is kind of tantamount to that whole feeling of, it was a, excuse my language, shit experience, but actually if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have gone on to do A, B, and C, or I wouldn't have had the strength, courage, whatever you want to call it, to to fulfill certain parts of my lifescape. And I think in this work, astrology, tarot, whichever it is, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of people that kind of have experiences that are quite formative for them. So I have another question for you.
Well, let me just follow up on that, because that's the 50-60% of psychotherapy is an investigation about how the past is, how the formulations of your understanding of the world or yourself, or even the imprint of relational patterns through the parents, they affect what we choose in life. Sometimes they get in the way, and we don't realize we're acting like a parent, or we're still reacting as if a life is like that. The mother, there's a famous book called The Motherless Fate, and it's like we were part of her substance once. We grew in her womb. We are intimately involved in her psychic dynamics, and to somehow separate from mother, which is a important myth, the myth of the hero must separate from the source from which he came in order to find out who he is.
Yes. Wow.
And who he is apart from his ancestral fate. Now, he's fated by that because he goes away with what he's learned from childhood. But there is in psychotherapy, when a person starts to see that they've identified with certain elements of childhood, certain ways of viewing things, and that they've been fated by them, then they can step outside that and then make a different choice. So it's a classic example that if people haven't been educated, let's say, in a family, or the parents are more do other things. They've run their own businesses, or they've found a way through life which is not necessarily through the educational stream. But that means they won't be on a course, if you like, in the collective. They found their own way. So a person might say, well, that's what I should do. Many people, 100 years ago, followed the family business. They didn't bother to find their own fate, but they found their own destiny through that pattern. Well, becoming free of those patterns is all part of psychotherapy, becoming conscious about how they've influenced you, so that you can then make, as I say, more informed choices about your own future. I mean, I think I had a lasting resentment about the way that I was brought up and all of that business, for many years. It was very, very difficult to be rid of a lot of the calamities and difficulties that I faced on a subjective and objective level. And these things imprint themselves, so they become part of your fate. But eventually, if you accept them as part of your life, which was part of your thing, if you do, then you can be liberated from them. They're no longer fetters or prison cells. They become part of your life from which you can then say, yes, I learned a lot about life through that. Took me a while, but I've let it go.
I'm laughing because there's a few experiences that I've had that I look back and I think, yeah, you know what, it did take me a while to get past that. But once I did, what it's enabled me to do has been invaluable, right? Which leads me really nicely onto something that you mentioned earlier that I really want to expand on,
Yeah.
especially as we have the advent and the rise of the superhero and, you know, the X-Men and the Marvel stuff. And I think one of the things that it, I kind of feel is important about that whole cinematic universe is it's tapping into something at a much deeper level. You know, this whole idea that the hero overcomes some form of difficulty, you know, whatever it is that they face, whoever the bad guy is, all of that sort of stuff. You know, insurmountable odds. We talked about this last time with the Lord of the Rings trilogy as well, when you see those kind of journeys. I think one of the things that's happened is myths have changed. It's no longer the story of Hercules. It's no longer the story of you know, many others. We're now seeing it happen and evolve in the superhero universe.
Yeah, yes.
And I think it's not so much about what we're seeing, it's about the depth of the story and how it touches us. You know, the same with Frank always mentions, for people that have Leo or strong Leo, the Harry Potters and the Star Wars. And I have a Leo ascendant. So for me, I was like, yeah, Harry, I totally get that. And I think one of the reasons we identify so strongly with that, there's a part of all human beings that tap into myth. There's this idea that we all have a destiny and we all have somewhere to go and we all have some challenge or issue that we have to work past in order to get to that moment of glory or success or even just survival. You know, so I want you to open that up for us, the importance of myth to humanity.
That's a massive.
Yeah, I know.
It's just so
Huge
massive.
one.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we ought to have an idea about what myth is and where it comes from.
Yeah.
Essentially, you know, through Homer, the Iliad, and various classical Greek philosophers, all these myths came from Greece and Rome. Every culture has its own myth. Yeah. And the interesting thing about these, when you look at them, or comparative mythology, as Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist of the 20th century, brilliant, and the interpretation of myths, when you look at them, they're fundamentally the same. They have heroes, they have enemies, they have the witch doctor or the magician or the wise old man or the wise old woman. You have the lovers, you have the baby, you have the father figures, you have the mother figures, you have the sea priestess or the seer. She's mysterious and so on. Now, all of these figures in mythology are productions of our own unconscious. The unconscious thinks in images. And there is a mythological layer of consciousness, if you like, in the evolution of the brain. So we started out, you know, probably as from the sea, then we came on land, turned into an insect or something, and then eventually we became reptiles or birds or whatever. And through the evolution of the species, the brain has developed. Now, there are arguments about how it developed. I don't want to go into all that, but there's two cerebral hemispheres here. The reflective content, the cerebral cortex, is a very recent addition. Before that, there was only kind of an essential brain, or
a reptile brain, I think.
A reptile brain and a palomammalian brain on top of that, which was the biped, or the ape man and so on. Anyway, that part of the brain started to perceive life in a very mythic way, that it was part of the world. There was a kind of participation mystique, that it saw things, that it understood things in what we would call a mythic way. And that is that the mind inherently has a capacity to make sense or meaning out of things. And that meaning faculty, meaning is a story. We tell stories about ourselves, and that's a faculty of consciousness. And so when we perceive a pattern in us, outside to us, and we connect with that pattern, we say, I relate to that. Like, I was turned on by that magician, that feeling. Well, I have a strong Uranus in my chart, which is the planet of the magician. I awoke, typically like Uranus. And I think there was a transit on of that planet at that time. You see, so what happens is we perceive outside certain patterns, innate patterns in us. These deep patterns, called archetypes or archetypal patterns, are the structures of the consciousness and mind. You have yours, you have your 22 major arcana, which is the major archetypes as seen through the tarot. We have 10 planets, which are the major archetypal forces. And these are mythologized as Greek heroes or gods or whatever, and they do miraculous things. They are perceptions of the mythic mind. Beautiful. And so therefore there is a perceptive organ in us looking out into the world, seeing a multiplicity of patterns that connect up to innate pattern structures in the mind. These are called archetype. And there's the main one that you're talking about is the great myth of the hero. And the great myth of the hero derives from the sun rising over the ascendant and then setting in the west. It rises in the east, and you know, that word set is, of course, comes from Egypt. It's the god Set. It's the falling of the sun into darkness, and then he goes here through his heroic struggle. And Joseph Campbell has written all about this in Hero with a Thousand Faces, and the various stages, all linked in with the symbolism of the sun, actually. The formation of an individual identity. It comes into life. It has its strengths. What it offers the world, you know, in terms of its profession and so on. And eventually, it fades out of existence into old age and death, passing its wisdom into the world of lived reality. So the heroic struggle was always one that ends in death, but nevertheless. It's the Sol Invictus, the victorious sun, even over death, because life continues even through winter, and then it appears again in spring. So all of this mythological world view is to do with recognizing essential patterns of meaning, essential patterns of development upon which life develops, essentially. And the archetypal symbolism of the hero, the call to adventure, the forming of friends and finding gifts along the way, the going around the world or conquering new territory, taking back what's unknown into the world. He's conquered it, and then it starts again. So that myth is something that appears all within us. Now, the Marvel comics, well, they have all kinds of mythological stuff. There was Thor, you know, with his hammer, and I think there's some recent Marvel stuff, Thor 1 and Thor 2, and there's all the Norse mythology with Loki. Loki in astrology is Mercury, a very trickster character, always telling lies. You never know whether he's truth. Is he there? Is he here? And we see him there, but we don't quite know where he is. As a kind of schemer, what's on the surface is never what's underneath. You have the trickster figure in the tarot.
We do in the tarot.
It's the first one. They call it the magician or the juggler, I know. But anyway, I could ramble on about myths, but we find that in deep dreams, archetypal dreams come to the surface of this mythological layer of mind, and and often when we have a problem, dreams show us in a mythical way, in a dramatic way, what the nature of the problem is and how to tackle it in symbolic form. Yeah. And if we can understand the nature of mythology or pattern as pictured in pictorial representations and stories, then we can apply that wisdom to our life. And sometimes the wisdom it has to say is much better than any rational or cognitive guidance.
Which leads me on to the next part of this, which is absolutely brilliant. I mean, I love the way that you talk about that, and I think it's really relevant. You know, this whole idea of the hero kind of ending in death.
The
The way I
sound is that just to intervene. Just sorry, intervene. The sound has gone down a bit. I don't know why. Perhaps you're not so close to the mic. We can get lost in the course of conversation.
That should do it. Yeah, so one of the things that you touched on there that I thought was really important to go back over is this idea of the hero's journey ending in death, you know, when the sun kind of sets. And what I love about that is when I think about the journey of a human life throughout, you know, the 70, 80 to 110 years, give or take. It is a hero's journey. Each and every one of us, you know, whatever we traverse in life, we have all of those things go through the entire span of our lives. And, you know, each one of us is on a quest of some sort. You know, whatever your soul is here to learn, it will kind of pick up along the way. And I love that. And I, you know, again, I have never believed that we just kind of fade off into obscurity. There's some part of you that always lives on. And I think for me, one of the things that I observed about myths was it is a way of the human mind or being to understand, okay, it seems like I have this and I'm going to fade from existence, but some part of me is always going to be here, you know, like, and it's kind of like that whole circle of life type of thing. What you brought up just now was really nice about the symbolism and how that works. And when you talk about dreams, straight away, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the High Priestess. The tarot card, the High Priestess.
Yeah.
She is the lady of unspeaking. She doesn't speak in words, or she'll give you images and feelings and impressions and intuitions about things, but never directly say what she kind of means. And dreams are super, super powerful. And yeah, I've always said that even the prophetic ones, it's a deeply human phenomena. And, you know, when we dream the future and see things that have happened, you know, hundreds, thousands of miles away, it's not supernatural. It's totally natural. You know, it's about as everyday as it gets. I think we've just been convinced somewhere that it's, you know, out there in the realm. But to bring it back to symbols, and I've seen Richard do this in person, actually, which was pretty bloody mind-blowing. In a class, I think you remember this, we were talking, or Richard was talking about Leo. So again, we're back to that.
We're talking about the multi-level dimensions of a symbol. And so that it has, when we see Leo and it's representative of the sun, there is a line of symbolism stemming from that in basically 4 planes of reality. We've got its meaning, we've got its psychological motivation, we have where it appears in life, power structures and the king and so on, whoever is the center of presence. And in the material realm, it can be, and I remember I was saying it could be represented by anything brightly orange and maybe the fruit of an orange. So I was saying that the symbolism stretches out. And I was mentioning this in the course of that class. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And while mentioning that, I think you also talked about a tendency to maybe not be necessarily 100% on time.
That's right, Leos, yes, because they're in their own time warp, you see, because Leo is the sign of the hero, interesting enough. It follows the hero myth, and it seeks to make life magical. It seeks to look out at life and everything's creative, everything's a possibility. It's that fire sign. And it seeks its significance. Fire seeks great significance in life, and it knows it's there somewhere. And so it makes things into a mythological thing. So if you're involved in that magical world of play and symbolism and drama and all that things associated with Leo, then obviously other person's time limits don't mean anything to you, do they? Because, you know, when I turn up is when I turn up, and they ought to be thankful that I have. Now, I'm being over the top. I'm sorry I don't mean to be rude to all Leos. I'm just playing around with that symbol, but they can get very self-involved, and they always make an entrance. They have to drop something or put up their hand first or bang the door or something. You know, I'm here, says the sign of Leo.
Yeah. Um,
you know. But at least it's not Aries who likes to make an entrance and injure you in some way, you know. A Leo just comes in and announces themselves. Whether they, it's funny how Leos don't have to say anything, but you always turn around and look at them.
yeah. That's brilliant.
And so, anyway, the story is she came in,
Right.
yeah,
And also had an orange representative of the sun in her bag. And I'd actually seen you talk about the symbolism, what it could mean, how it could
you've become a bit more quiet there. I don't know what's going on, but just to keep it at a level, I thought you'd like to know.
Yeah, just seeing it play out in physical terms and the way that it had happened was brilliant, because I'd literally watched you talk about the symbolism, what that means, how it might play out in, you know, in the physical realm,
Yeah.
and literally within minutes this lady representing all of that had walked in, and I remember you saying to her, do you, you know, do you have Leo in your chart? And she was like, yeah, I'm a Leo ascendant. It was just a really fantastic moment of seeing how astrology can be applied to everyday life, and how the symbolism can be really accurate when you're tapped into it. So I guess what I want to ask you next is, um, how does it work? You know, how do you see the symbols, and how do you weave them into what some people call a prediction?
The realm that you and I are involved in is the realm of image. And we contemplate an image, usually centered around an archetype, which is a pattern. And we ought to make this distinction, I think. And I'm going to pick a bone with you about the High Priestess, although I may be wrong. So we'll come back to what you said. The mind has a capacity for creating images of things. It's a very artistic, poetic framework of mind. It's called the imaginal experience. And it's to do with how we understand or form pictures or ideas. And so astrology, first of all, was an unconscious projection of man's imagination onto the stars. We imagine that's Hercules, or that's so-and-so, or we imagine that they were gods. They were called the wandering stars as opposed to the fixed stars. And so man's imagination looks for a place on which to place its patterns. But those patterns are not just fictional realities. They stem from a deep part in us that recognizes a pattern. You see, and that's where I think the imaginal realm is not so much fiction. You know, superheroes are fictional characters in an unliteral sense, in a literal sense, but actually they exist in a plane of reality which we recognize. And it's that plane of reality, the imaginal, the mythic, the heroic, we recognize something of a truth in them. I mean, all of those Marvel characters that have animal powers, for example, you know, Spider-Man links to a spider, or Wolfman, half Wolverine is, you know, all that. They combine the animal and the human. That's a very astrological thing in Sagittarius, half horse, half human, and it seems to connect to that strata of life where we were part animal, where animal powers come to the fore. Very interesting that zodiacs is called the circle of animals, but the image that's produced stems from a realm of mind. You could call it a psychic realm of mind. And when you and I are playing with images, we're playing in the astral realm. We're playing in a realm where behind the image is a force of energy, a dynamic center of force. That's what an archetype is. It has power and influence, but it's influenced through form. And so there are two aspects to an image. We got the actual form of the image, and then we've got a power behind it. So when we evoke the image of Mars, Mars is god of war. War invokes a kind of dynamism of conflict and power and a self-assertion, and certain magical lines of thinking. When you think along these lines, particularly if it's talismans or something, you can invoke that force. And I just recognized there I got a little bit more Martian and a little bit more deliberate as I started to describe it. This is called invoking through the energy dynamic of it. Now, so you have archetypes, which are the imaginary the imagination's idea of what the instincts are in us. The instincts there, the dynamic forms of interaction with the world are there, and we produce images. So the tarot are a series of archetypal images.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. We work in those images. There are also archetypal experiences: birth, death, loss, leaving home. These are common. So archetypes are common patterns to everybody that we find in our own individual way. So when you're working with the high priestess, I don't think I think it was a bit inaccurate, or I don't know or what to say what it was, but I felt myself a little bit at odds. She says things in her own way.
She speaks, yes, but she never speaks direct.
No, this is. I just want to be. I'm Mars in Virgo, so you'll have to excuse the position-oriented mind that I have. I think she does speak. This could be semantics rather than difference of opinion, but she doesn't speak in a rational way. She doesn't speak like Gandalf spoke. You know, we talked about the difference between Gandalf as a wise man, and the wise man knows all the languages, can speak, he influences, he knows a bit of magic, can do that, but basically he talks his way through things because he's wise.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Galadriel is on the priestess side. She speaks from her heart, from her imagination, and she says wild things sometimes, but they're true. And she speaks to a different level. So she speaks directly, but she doesn't speak the language of rationality. She doesn't speak Aquarian language. She's not very precise in her definitions because she wants her descriptions to help you through the veil of rationality. She speaks the language of metaphor and poetry. And this is where myth and story can help us tremendously. I once had, when I was working on my mother complex in Jungian analysis, I had a picture of my mother being burnt, and my analyst said, well, that reminds me of Hansel and Gretel, how you get rid of the old witch. She's burnt. You have to.
Right.
The fire of transformation has to literally change the form. And in my dream, this burning wasn't effective enough. It wasn't doing anything. So through metaphor, it was saying, really, you have to shove her fully into the oven. Now, I'm using metaphor, but I have to find the fire to counteract whatever the mother force was in me. You see? So the unconscious mind uses this very clever metaphoric image-like things, and that's her language. That's my point. That's her language. If she comes over into our world, she's moved into a masculine, rationally defined thing that you have to do. No, she wants to keep it loose, to keep it more wise is wrong, but more informative from the heart, from the soul.
Yeah,
did you know the difference I'm trying to make, or have I been?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting point you make, and I think for everybody viewing, the reason we've brought this up is there is a scene. I think it's actually in The Hobbit, where you see Galadriel. She's bathed in blue, all of her, and it kind of becomes part of the floor, and you can see the crescent moon in the background.
The gold light, the silver blue light above her head is such a
it's a beautiful scene, and when you look at it, for those of us that know symbolism, that know tarot, and even if you know astrology, you kind of look at that image and say that is ripped right out of a tarot deck or an astrology book. What they've characterized on the screen is a very powerful symbol for the intuition, for the feminine, for the sacred feminine as well, if you want to take it even further. And it's true, the sacred feminine, the intuitive aspect of all of us doesn't necessarily communicate, as we do, or as you say,
That's
in
right.
my Aquarianness, they will use that flowery, poetic, almost mystical and mythical sort of ethereal. Like, I've got goosebumps as I'm talking about it because I kind of feel that energy. And it's the same when I see the High Priestess card. What I really love about what you talked about there is when you talk about this imaginal realm. And it's true. When I studied for years to read tarot, and I read book after book after book, and you see the same symbols and the same cards mean the same things, but different people say it in different ways. What happens there is your subconscious is building this understanding of what that archetype means, what kind of powers it might come with and bestow, or what kind of experiences it might create. And then as a reader, when you read for people, it's in a way you kind of predict their pattern. You kind of get this idea of what is likely to take place after the decisions or the experiences they have, and where they go with them.
Well, this takes us back to the question about how it works, which we wandered off a bit, but we wandered back onto it. Is there's some element of the psyche and the brain itself which is perceiving patterns of experience. Sometimes it's the flight of birds, the old ogres that used to read the prediction in flights of birds, or there's loads of omancies, isn't there? There's this
Cartomancy,
or
arrow reading,
geomancy, and it should be astrology and so on. But or palmistry, the chiromancy. It's reading the pattern, and some part of us is more tuned to reading patterns than the intellect. This is why I had a quibble about she doesn't talk to me directly. She does, but in her own language, and her language requires us a little bit more moon wisdom. The wisdom of the body, the wisdom of metaphor. And that's where Galadriel is such a beautiful figure. She's extremely powerful, but we've said this before, but it's worth saying again,
yeah.
that when they come to see her in the first Hobbit movie, she asks them, where is Gandalf? And of course, he's fallen into a pit with a Balrog or something, and he's fighting it away, but we think he's dead. And so when she asks the question, she looks away and she looks into her mystic feeling world, and she's asking our heart, actually. If you tune into your heart and you have an image of somebody, you can often feel how they feel, especially if you've got your moon in Cancer like you have, right? And I've got my Mercury in Cancer, so I think of the image and I can tune in to how they might be feeling. And when she tunes into feeling, she doesn't believe it. She acknowledges her feeling as a psychic reality.
Yep.
Because that reality of feeling an underworld pattern and intuition is not rational. It's sub-rational. It's beneath. And so it's in the animal powers. It's in the water. It's in the flight of birds. It's in the moon's position. So she acknowledges that he's disappeared. And she said, all she can see in her imaginary eye is he's fallen into shadow. Because the other people think he's dead. Because he obviously fell into a big pit with a horrible monster. But all she says, so her imaginal description of what Gandalf, where he is, he's in shadow. He's been removed from the physical appearance, but he's not necessarily dead, and that's all she sees. And she comforts them and actually says, we don't know. We don't know the whys and wherefores of what is happening. So she doesn't say that, but she implies we don't know the outcome. But she can't see it because he's fallen from view into the underworld, which is down that pit of the archaic forms of life. And it goes right back down. And the Balrog is, of course, from the fire and from earth and fire. Anyway, so that form of perception, which is so attuned to tarot, I think it's a very moon-oriented thing, but you have to interpret with rationality to make sense. So cerebral hemispheres and what you know about psychology or whatever, how you describe it is formed by what you know, but the actual information comes through on a psychic or an intuitive, or you can pick up on the collective mind. And we don't know exactly how it works, but occultism has various explanations about that particular world, and you can explore that terrain through certain rituals and certain diagrams. You can even go in and talk to your tarot, and you see it's very fascinating the way you're talking in the mood. It's the high priestess. Here she comes. Like, she's a living reality. She's an archetypal image. But to say she's an archetypal image means that you pretend that she exists.
Mm.
But then does she really exist? You see, because she's an image. So the human mind can only know things through image and word. So beyond that, the realm of perception is very limited. So as I'm saying, she represents a force. She represents a form and a type of perception, and she has a certain kind of guidance. And she's also in us.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really, really important point to get across. We all have our own inner high priestess because she represents the intuition. Take away everything else that you might know, read, imagine, whatever about her. She is effectively that faculty within us to connect to our moon. Which governs your waters, your deeper feelings, your inner kenning, as they called it in old Scotland. Your keen sense of knowing, just knowing something absolutely, but not necessarily knowing how. Like that underneath.
It's instinctual. She's Diana, also part of Artemis, and she has that. She's also the sea priestess, and so she's a kind of combination image of the feminine. And she has dogs there, and she has the moon, and she knows the shadows of the night and what they mean. This is all to do with the underworld, and she forms a wisdom from that point of view. It's very fascinating dogs. Rupert Sheldrake did a lot of interesting experiments on telepathy in dogs. I don't know whether you've seen that, but he produced a film in which dogs know when their owners are coming home.
No, I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's great. And they get rid of all the possible things that could clue the dog. Right? Is he coming home at 5 o'clock? Is it just the struggle? Is it the turn in the weather? But no, they had it all times of the day. They didn't even tell the dog that the bloke had gone out, and the dog, sure enough, when he's returning home from work, it's the afternoon or the evening, the dog perks up within 20 minutes of his arrival.
Wow.
And this shows that there's an underlying, perhaps a morphic resonance, as Sheldrake calls it, that the mind extends beyond its immediate vicinity. We see in astrology we have Mercury and Uranus. Mercury rules the cognizant mind, our rational mind, our thinking process, and the sign that it's in reflects the way we process information. Very important planet. But Uranus represents the collective mind. And anybody that has a Mercury Uranus in their chart has a tap into it. And you have the sun in Aquarius again. So your rationality, your purpose is linked in with this collective substratum of connection of the humanity. You could call that the etheric web of the earth, or the anima mundi, the soul of the world. However you connect into it, that mind, the greater mind of humanity, can sometimes impinge itself on the individual mind. And it's there that you pick up things. It's there that a pattern has hit you. You don't know where from. It could be the flight of birds. It could be the turn of the weather. It could be something, but something's happening. And the mythic mind can interpret that pattern and bring it forth as a projection, as a prediction, or as a knowledge, or something like that. Now, we could go into other forms of prognostication. But the symbol and pattern enables us to, if you like, see the unfolding of the pattern. If a person, this brings us back right to the very first beginning. If a person is predictable in their reactions to things, then you can predict what's going to happen to them.
Absolutely.
And now, if the person become informed and know that something is going on, they might choose to react to it differently, to see it as a lesson in life, or okay, I'm not going to react to it. One of the first exercises I give to couples that are arguing all the time, I did couples therapy for people for 7 years in London, is to have a day without one of you not arguing. No matter what the other person says, don't argue. You may feel the things, but sustain it, suppress it, push it in. See where the arguments go. See what formulates from that. See how you're projecting your anger and annoyance and resentment on the person. Hold it back. That can change a person. Just simple behavioral exercise of changing behavior. It changes the pattern. So the person becomes less predictable. So then we can unlock the potentiality of the pattern in other directions.
So yeah.
So in that way, you start to co-create your own fate. But the pattern is there. You know, if you've got a Saturn transit, it's the same pattern. What you do with it depends on your knowledge of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually really like that. It's very true as well. I think knowledge of self comes into that, but also knowledge of the symbolism, you know, as you mentioned there, I think is really important. Yeah, you've definitely given me a lot to think about, you know, with how some of that works, and also how we interpret it. I think it's just a really, really good point that you make.
Well, I think interpretation depends on your own individual study. I mean, you can get a very highly intuitive person, but unless they have a vocabulary or a way of explaining what they intuit, it comes out very vaguely, or they can't explain their understanding of what they're feeling. You know, so it requires a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of reading what other people have said, so that you have a toolbox of explanation from which these images can then float through and then be explained.
Yeah, absolutely. So that you have something to give pertinent examples from. I think that's always really important. Obviously, knowledge and the depth of knowledge over the symbolism is really important. I think one of the things that I've always noticed is when you do readings for people, and I've always felt this, that some part of your energy kind of reaches out to theirs, mingles in with it a bit, and kind of brings back information. I mean, they've already proven that takes place just in a conversation. So when you take it further and start to add symbolism of tarot, symbolism of astrology, it's almost like you have a deeper and broader perspective to draw from. And your knowledge of those symbols is what kind of allows you to make those predictions.
Well, absolutely. And in psychoanalysis, it's called transference and countertransference. And what happens is that the therapist, accidentally or by design, invokes a certain force or a certain image of who you are from the client. So the client turns you into their mother or their father, or the worst hated enemy in existence, or a fraud, or whatever it is. And you take that projection on, and you're trained to deal with it, to not be so attacked by it. But the therapist also has a countertransference in relation to the client, and that countertransference is dealt with by what we call the inner supervisor. And you there's a conversation going on about your reactions of hate, or sometimes people have been talking about the most horrible things, and I haven't felt anything. You know, so my countertransference, and I'm thinking, why is this made up? Is this science? But they can't be making it up. And so what happens is I found that my reaction is telling me they're really out of touch with the feeling of it, because I'm out of touch with the feeling of it. And this, you can sometimes tell a liar or somebody that's saying something on the surface, but their reactions are not quite there. So countertransference is an inner reaction in my mind or my feelings or my thoughts, and you learn to translate that, but you don't communicate that to the client unless it's necessary. So that's a form of telepathy, and it's immediate. But telepathy stretches beyond just the immediate experience, because I've had, and no doubt you've had, certain things in which you can see things going on, or and that's called a prognostication by the heads. Things just come to you. And the other one we talked about, this divination by the bones, is about setting up a pattern which you can interpret. Divination by the head is a direct knowing.
Yeah, very Uranian.
That's very Uranian. And there's also a divination by the spirit, which is very Neptunian, in which you talk with angels, or you talk with something, or spirits of the whatever kind, or something comes to you in the order of a prophecy or a vision. That's knowledge of a different order, more to do with the soul, more to do with Neptune. But there are different forms. Ours is very mercurial in a way that we divine a pattern. But there are other forms which come into our work.
Oh, absolutely.
And occasionally they intrude, and you don't know where they've come from, but they're relevant.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's where the I don't really have a term for it, but sometimes the cards, the symbols of planets, the transits that you see, that's one thing, and it gives you a certain set of information. And then once your intuition kicks in, or your high priestess starts kind of throwing her weight around, you do get the other from it, those bits of information that you might not be seeing in the symbol, but the intuition has taken over to give you, actually, there's this happening as well. There's this that's probably likely to transpire. And these person that you're reading for, whomever, needs to know this information. And sometimes it will come spiritually, by another being, very mediumistic in that sort of way, or like you said, very telepathic in other ways, which is really interesting stuff. I think you've probably had as well in when you've been doing astrology readings for people, it just sometimes it kind of takes on a totally different realm. Other information just comes to you, loosely attached to the symbols.
Sometimes that's the case, but there's controlled psychism and there's wild psychism, and a lot of psychics just pick up lots of things, and they fish around, and they say this and that, and they might get one or two hits or something, and it's a generality, like I can tell your early life, it's coming through, you were born at a very early age and your mother was there at the time. All that rubbish. all that rubbish, and then eventually they hit upon something. It's a very loose form of psychism, whereas our work is centered through the symbol. It focuses the imagination and concentrates on that, and it allows that to take us a little away or to inform us. So that kind of psychism is more trained and is less likely to go off at a tangent and then disappear into the subconscious cells of our own subjectivity. That's the problem. Pure psychism sometimes can't tell whose vision is for who, and they sit in a circle and it could be there, and it's all kind of vague until you center on something. Whereas our kind of focused psychism is more direct, it's more trained, and if you find yourself wandering off into a trance or a vision, it might be necessary. I've had the occasional images which arise, but I always praise it. I've always put them in a frame, and I say, look, I'm getting an image, or I'm getting this scene, and I don't know why. It's not directly related to what we're talking about, and so I take it out of the main theme, and then I say, and very often it is totally relevant, but it's like in our work, something has intruded to come and tell us something. It tells us something, but we then get back on track.
Absolutely. I think that's where your training comes in, as you said. I also think it's where, you can, for me personally, I think that when you get a reader, whether it's astrology or tarot, you can spot the ones that are what I would say is decent or are good at what they do, or proficient even is a good word, because they've done the work around their own stuff. They've delved into who they are, what they're about, and they're able to separate all of their own inner, whatever words you want to use.
I love this Aquarian word, or In actual practice, it never is perfect, but you learn to lessen the contamination.
Yes.
Of it, and sometimes that contamination, as I've called it, is not. It's a reaction of your own, but you can catch it as a reaction, and it can tell you something about the person. That's the countertransference, if you can relay it. So your image reactions, your thoughts, they go off. They're connected to associations you don't understand, but you can say them. But as long as you don't go off too much in different directions, otherwise you lose the thread.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree.
There's something else I wanted to say about an earlier thing about how it works.
Mm.
And we've talked about psychism and so on, but at a lower level of mind, underneath the mythic, is the archaic level, or the magical level. And that's at the level of energy dynamics. By that I mean the dynamics and flows of energy, certain principles of number and dimensions. It's rather like sacred geometry and things. At that level, there is a certain level of life which operates like that through certain laws, and that's where the magical level works, because if you can influence the energetic level, like the pranic level of life,
mm-hmm.
That energy system is then spread out through your aura, if you like, or maybe even through a process of mind. That's a controlled magical exertion of an imprint that you've made. And it's magical because you send it out. And so at that level, magic exists in the sense of rather like homeopathic patterns. You take one pill and a person can be cured magically. It's strange, but the pattern brings it back into order, because the pattern has been broken, and so you need a renewed one. So I'm saying that it can work at that level as well, that the vibrational rates of your chakras or whatever can pick up a vibrational rates about what's going in. And again, if you're trained in symbology of some form, a symbolic system, it works through that rather than a vague orientation. Otherwise you'd be picking up everything everywhere and you become simply the dustbin of life. We have to have protective, mate. That's what they call Pisces, isn't it? The dustbin of the zodiac, because it's a terrible phrase, but it's as if they wander through life picking up all of what's going on in it, people's feelings and
sponge, a total sponge.
And often Pisces have that great difficulty defining who they are amidst all that chaos of everything. It's kind of like swimming in the ocean and never finding an end to it. Pisces is a bit tricky to be part of, but it's part of their gift. They're never entirely here in the world of incarnate reality. Can't do that because too far from sea, is it? At least us with Cancerians, a chart, we wander on the shoreline. You see, we're half in the sea and half out of the sea, and we wander along the shore, sometimes in the water, sometimes out of the water. It's a better place to be.
Absolutely. I really, really like that.
Just playing with the symbolism.
Richard, where can people reach you? How can they get hold of you? And what is the name of your channel so that people can
Okay, well, I've done various things on the channel, various videos, some for the experts, some not. Depends what you want, really. Most of it's on a lot of political things. I've done a lot to do with the Brexit votes and event chart astrology and Boris Johnson and various bits and pieces. And the early ones were about the imagination and things. So you can look on there. It's just simply Richard Swatton, astrologer.
Awesome. So I'm going to put a link for that in the description box below.
And as far as my public infrastructure goes about where people get hold of me, I've been hopeless, absolutely hopeless. I haven't got a website. My Facebook consists of a thing, so I have to get all that. You are way in advance of me of all that. I've got an email, I've got things in books, but I prefer always direct contact if I can. So it's people that can get hold of me on my email or my telephone number, and I would prefer, if possible, to go through you with that if people contact you, and we can come to some arrangement on that.
Okay, awesome. So
For the time being, while I haven't got that infrastructure, you know, you young people, you know how to do it. Or
I'm a millennial. It's
where
part of.
you quicker brains. You know, it took me bloody 10 years to have a mobile. I was thinking, you know, moving on from the past. Yes, they're archaic, and now I won't be without one. You know, it's
Yeah.
so. It takes me a while to get into the modern technology, but I find it wonderfully brilliant for communication and getting the knowledge out. So that's how people can get hold of them if they want to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on my channel. Thank you so much for this talk. It's always enlightening. I always learn something new from Richard. I just think you're brilliant, and I think a lot of what you say is so ordered and so eloquent. Like, you know pretty much everything about anything, which is why I'm always going to pick your brains.
I wouldn't go that far, but it's taken a long time to get it in order, and I'm still finding things out. But thanks for saying that anyway.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going
and perhaps another time we'll have a little talk about all the magical dimensions. I know you want to talk about manifestation and
yes.
How symbols can be used in a magical sense too, how you operate with them and work with them in a more technical way. We could look at what you do with symbols, and I do perhaps another time, because that's the, you know, that realm is what we work with all the time, and it might be worth trying to articulate actually what we do, what the mechanics are and how it works. So I've enjoyed today very much to at least skim some of the surfaces of these important questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to